Okay. Um, yes, I got it. Um, so anyway, it's my great pleasure to introduce the so-called guy who will be giving us a talk tonight on the so-called dollars in the Mega Red Book. Jeff, take it away.
When the Mega Red Book came out about 8 years ago, Dennis Tucker, the publisher, and Ken Percent are both good friends of mine. I've been trying to talk to them for years into putting so-called dollars into the Red Book. And I came close once or twice, but I could never get them quite to do it. But when the Mega Red Book came out 8 years ago, they called me up and said, how many pages do you want? I said, how many can I have? And they said, just tell me what you want. So I put about 20 or 30 or 40 pages of so-called dollars in each edition of the Mega Red Book for the last 8 years. This year I did a section on, I'm sorry, I apologize. It is powering up. It should be coming up pretty quick here. I did a section on Lauer medals from the California Midwinter Exposition, 1893. Last year before that, I did so-called dollars from the 1876 Centennial Exposition. This is actually a presentation that was given by Dennis Tucker, Bill Hyder, myself a few years ago. Dennis Tucker contacted us and said he wanted to, he said he's seen a number of presentations that Bill Hyder and I had done together, and he wanted to do a presentation with us. We put this one together for that. So the first medal you see here is the official medal from the Philadelphia Exposition, is held in 1876. And it was struck by United States Mint. It was engraved by Charles Barber. It's struck in silver, 4 different bronze varieties, and a gold-plated variety. And when you look at that medal, you see Liberty. She represents the United States, and she's in a reclining position, and she's standing up, rising up, reaching for the stars and glory above her. And the message the United States was giving to the rest of the world at this time, because truthfully, at that time, most of Europe still considered the United States to be a third world country. So the message the United States was giving to the rest of the world at that time was the United States was going to be rising up to be recognized as a world power. And normally, in heraldry, you have an olive branch in your right hand, which means you prefer peace, and a sword in your left hand, which means you will defend yourself. But in this case, Liberty is holding the sword in her right hand, which means that basically don't mess with us. Next one, please.
Okay.
Oh, and if you think, what? I'm sorry, what's that, Jason?
Got it. Got it.
So this is the obverse and the reverse. Go ahead and do the next one, please.
Okay.
This is the official medal from the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. It was held in Chicago. Does anybody, well, I guess it's all muted, so I can't really ask questions. So instead of asking questions, I'll just answer it. This was engraved by George Morgan. There's a little M mint mark on the lower right edge of the edifice on the obverse. That's similar to the M mint mark, or not mint mark, but engraver's signature that you see on the wreath of a Morgan dollar. So this was originally struck in a brassy type material, but it tarnished rather quickly, so they replaced it with a gold-plated variety. So 90% of the metals you see are gold-plated, but the original ones, the Ori-eyed, or the original strikings, and they're quite scarcer. This is also struck in a number of other metals, such as silver and aluminum, and white metal, but those other varieties were never really offered for sale. They're just like the white metal ones came out of Morgan's estate when they auctioned off some of his metals quite a few years later after he passed away. So next one, please.
Oh, there we go.
Now this is also the same metal, but this is struck on a large cent. This, and on the right-hand side, you can see a little yellow outline of the bust of the large cent, the neck and the bust hairline area. This is actually in Bill Hyder's collection. It's a unique piece. Next one, please. And this is the reverse of that same metal. And Bill Hyder actually drew those little markings there, so you kind of see how the original host large cent was, you can still see it below there. I know Bill said he couldn't join us today. He's driving to, forget where he said, but he's driving somewhere. Actually, we were at the A&A in Chicago last week. We had a nightmare trip getting back. We were supposed to get back on Saturday. We ended up getting back on Sunday. He actually drove home on Monday, 2 days ago. Next slide, please. So this is the Wilson dollar. This struck in 1920 at the Manila Mint. This is also engraved by George Morgan. There's a little microscopic M, on the truncation of Wilson's bust. This is the only overseas mint the United States ever had. And I actually procured these dies, these original dies engraved by George Morgan. I bought them about 10 or 15 years ago. I bought them from an individual who said that his father was stationed in the military in the army in the Philippines when the Japanese were invading. And the Japanese bombed the mint and it was destroyed. And he says that his uncle or great uncle, I forget who it was, maybe it was his grandfather, I forget, found these dies in the rubble of the mint. So I ended up buying them, and in 2020, on the 100th anniversary of the striking of this metal, I had Daniel Carr use the same obverse die, but a slightly modified reverse die. This reverse die says to commemorate the opening of the Manila Mint, and I changed it to commemorate the anniversary of the Manila Mint, and I restruck those metals and sold them as souvenirs, at that time. I actually strike 1 or 2 metals every year, and I try to tie the metals I strike into some type of contemporary theme. There are actually 5 of these struck in gold, but there's actually 6 originals known. There may be more. When I did the restrikes, I sold 22 restrikes in gold, but they are different, and they're also dated 2020 instead of 1920. Next slide, please. This is a book that was published by Bill Hyder and I. We've written several books. This book also won the award as the best book of the year on metals and tokens. The book about Jules Charbonneau. He was a very interesting individual. Has ties in with Farron Zerbe, the Emmy Hart coins of the Golden West, and several other things. Next slide, please. So here's a little story about Jules Charbonneau. He was actually born in 1883. He apprenticed into the U.S. Navy. He was like 16 or 17 at the time. He took a test and scored so high that they said they let him sign up on any ship that he wanted to. So he signed up on a major ship. I forget which one it was. Ended up going to the Paris Exposition in 1900 and bought a few miniatures there. Developed an interest in collecting miniatures, and actually it was pretty well known as attending a lot of expositions worldwide in the early 1900s. Next slide, please. So this is one of the medals he struck at the Golden Gate International Exposition. He actually struck about 16 different varieties. This is the first variety, is 1D, which stood for $1. It says 10, well, actually, this is the second variety. The first one did not say 10K, it just said solid gold. But it really was only 10K, so he came up with another variety that added a 10K to it. But then the United States Mint, not the Mint, but the Treasury Department, he was striking gold coins, and it was illegal to strike gold coins. So he actually changed it from a 1D to a 1 star, and they allowed them to continue striking souvenir metals and selling them at the exposition. Next slide, please. So here's some of the different $1 gold medals that are struck by Jules Charbonneau. 1D solid gold, 1D 10K solid gold, 1 star 10K solid gold. Then he made some 22 karat gold varieties and overstamped them with 22 karat and other similar types of varieties. So he struck these in gold. There's these 5 different gold varieties. Next slide, please. And yeah, I don't have more slides on it, but he struck some in silver and in copper as well. So the 1894 California Midwinter Exposition, I actually have a print of this hanging on my wall. There is supposedly about 10 of them that exist today. And I bought it from an advanced Midwinter or advanced, California Midwinter Exposition collector that sold it to me about 10 years ago. He lived in San Francisco. He still does live there. Probably many of you know him. Next page, next slide, please. So this is the electric tower. It wasn't really as it originally was conceived to be. Originally, it was going to have a ball of gold on the top of it, a big circle mined in California up to that date. But instead, they put a giant searchlight on the top of it, and it was so bright that it would shine into areas of San Francisco and light it up like as if it was daylight. They had a restaurant on the lower tower, and I think on the middle level as well. And then you could go up to the upper level and have a view from there. Next slide, please. So these are some of the attractions at the exposition. The Gum Girls on the bottom left. They were controversial because they were considered risque. Yeah. But they were also unescorted, which was not really proper in that era. To the right is the ball of gold that was originally intended to be on top of the light tower, instead as it was in one of the attractions in the exposition. And up the upper left was the Dante's Inferno. It was supposed to be, it was actually, from all accounts, a very realistic, scary exposure of what the afterlife would be like for those who did not lead a proper life. Next slide, please. So here is the official medal from that exposition. This medal is also engraved by George Morgan. The United States Mint actually sent a representative that took the dies from Philadelphia, went through the over the isthmus by where the Panama and through Panama and up, took a steamship up to San Francisco, brought these dies up there, made arrangements with a local press to set the dies up there and struck these medals as souvenirs for the exposition. On the opening day, the very first day of the exposition, gold-plated varieties were struck. After that, they struck them in brass. Next slide, please. And here's just some information about the California State Seal, which is basically the design that was that Morgan copied for the obverse of the California Midwinter Medal. Next slide, please. So one of the things that Bill Hyder and I, we like to tell stories, we write articles and books, and I acquired some strikings of medals. On the left it says Die Trial 1. In the center it says HK 245, that's the obverse and reverse of the gold-plated variety. On the right it says Die Trial 2. Well, these were actually blundered dies that were struck in reverse image. I'd have to think about how they did it at the moment, but we actually wrote an article about it. And from what I recall, it won an award with the ANA. I don't remember as the best article of the year, but it may have been. And actually, when we were at the ANA last week, we did receive the second place award from the numismatist, the ANA's publication for the Adna Wildy. No, what is it? I forget what it is. But anyhow, we received some award for an article we published that, if any of you are members of the ANA, it was on the cover page about 6 months ago about the Dickeson Continental dollars. Mm-hmm. At that time, up until we published that article, the common belief was those medals were struck for the Centennial Exposition in 1876. We proved that they were actually struck related to the Civil War as alternative funding methods for the Civil War in 1860 or 1861. Next slide, please. So here's just some markings that we had, and I'm not really going to go over that right now. We'll go to some other slides. So next one, please. And if for those of you that have Hibble and Kappan's standard reference book on so-called dollars, these are the expositions that are listed in it. There's about 25 expositions, some major and some minor. And many of you probably know it, but probably some of you don't. Bill Hyder and my next book is imminent. We were hoping to have it ready for the ANA in Chicago. We missed that deadline. Now we're hoping to have it ready for the fun show in Orlando in January, which is maybe optimistic because it still has another month or two to kind of wrap it up, and then a month or two at the printers. but it's a possibility. But as far as our next book is going to be starting to replace the current reference book written by Hibbler and Kappen. And in our book, we're going to have over 60 different expositions that were held in the United States versus the 25 or so that Hibbler and Kappen mentioned. So it's going to have hundreds of medals and information of medals and varieties that were not previously cataloged. Next slide, please. So here's the 1954 Cradle of the Union. This medal is struck in gold, is also struck in silver and copper. The obverse has the Albany Straat Haas building, and I think that's where the First Continental Congress met. I'm not sure, I'd have to check my notes. I actually have one on my other computer, but since we're so late, I'm going to kind of just skip that. But to the right was an adaptation of a advertisement placed by Ben Franklin trying to get the colonies to unite. He was saying if we unite, we'll have a better opportunity against the British. If we don't, we will look like that chopped up snake. So join and unite or die. And that's a design concept by Franklin that was on the reverse of this 1954 medal. Next slide, please. So here is an original Dickeson Continental dollar, and unfortunately it says 1876 because the slideshow I'm showing you was one we put together quite a few years ago. And if I ever put it together again, it should say 1860. So, and this is kind of also incorrectly referred as a Dickeson Continental dollar restrike. Well, it's not a restrike. It's an original striking. Dickeson, Montreal Dickeson was a famous numismatist. He actually wrote one of the first encyclopedias on coin collecting. And he just made a design that was similar to the Continental dollar, but nobody in that time would ever confuse it as a Continental dollar. I don't think too many people would today, but perhaps some would. But he just made this design with a Continental dollar on it. It's designed similar to the Continental dollar. And struck them along with quite a few other medals. Dickeson probably struck a dozen or more different medals promoting various things that he believed in. Next slide, please. So the reason why this Continental dollar restrike or Continental dollar medal, not restrike, but striking is so popular is because truthfully, you can look in, well, just for a moment, truthfully, you can look in dealers' junk boxes and find Continental dollar medals that, are just copies that are worth $5 or whatever. But the reason why these dies are so sought after by collectors today is because not only were they, created by Montreal Dickeson in 1860, but these dies fell into the hands of quite a few prominent numismatists over the years. And probably many of you are familiar with Thomas Elder. Well, Thomas Elder acquired these dies and restruck them with a number of other dies that he had, as did Q. David Bowers. In 1960, Q. David Bowers acquired these original Dickeson dies, and he struck some white metal copies of them. In 1961, Bashlow acquired the dies, and he struck them in silver, goldine, and bronze. And what's interesting, well, there's a couple things that's interesting. One is one obverse die of this obverse die that you see here. I'm not sure if it's the obverse or reverse, but just that die was actually in a auction. I forget if it was Stax or Heritage about maybe 2 months ago. I was planning on bidding on it. I was thinking I should be able to pick it up between $5,000 and $10,000. It sold for over $100,000, which I have it doesn't really make sense as to the reason why. But I have those hubs. Now, what Dickeson did when he created those dies is he claimed that those dies could never be used again because he donated them to the Smithsonian. What he failed to mention is prior to donating them to the Smithsonian, he created hubs for those, and I have those hubs. I sent those hubs to Daniel Carr, and he's in the process of making new dies for me. So I will be to a certain degree, continuing along with the tradition of the Dickeson, Elder, Bowers, Bashlow dies. And later this year, I'm going to be issuing a set of medals using the hubs from those Dickesons, those original dies as well. Next slide, please. So here is an example of Q. David Bowers' 1961 edition. If you look to the left, you'll see the word Continental. And below the C of Continental, there's a diagonal gash in that line area there. That's a characteristic of the Bowers white metal, as are several others. And truthfully, when I got interested in collecting these metals about 20 to 30 years ago, I did not know how to tell apart who struck what, when, where. And I checked with every expert I could. I forget the name of the guy at the moment that wrote the book on elder metals. But I also contacted Q. David Bowers and dozens of other people and basically found out that nobody really knew how to tell them apart. So around that time, I started writing a series of articles and giving presentations on different die characteristics and strikings and things on how to tell them apart. Now that's kind of become integrated into our hobby's knowledge base. Next slide, please. Well, here's an advertisement placed by Q. David Bowers when he was selling the white metal examples. Next one, please. That's when he was with Empire Coin. And here's a little original slip, an envelope that came in. Next one, please. And this is a silver variety struck by Bashlow. If you look at the very bottom, so just a little bit to the left, you see an S there. That's not a mint mark. That actually stands for silver. So all of the silver metals struck by Bashlow, restruck by Bashlow, and these are actually restrikes, the silver ones have an S on it. Next one, please. And here's the goldine variety that was done by Bashlow. And the next one. And here's the bronze variety. And probably many of you are aware that Bashlow acquired a number of different dies. He struck similar types of metals in basically the same compositions. He had the Summer Islands pig metal that he did that with. He also did the Confederate cent. He restruck them with shattered dies and several other things as well. Next slide, please. So here is what, and there's some envelopes there. Go ahead, next one. Those are some envelopes of the original metals that were marketed by Bashlow. Next, in silver and goldine. Here, and also the Boy Scouts in 1964 somehow acquired the original Dickeson die and modified it with the Jamboree 64 on it and struck metals using those original dies as well. That was in 1964. Next slide, please. And here's just a cool medal from the 1894 California Midwinter Exposition. It has the fairgrounds down below, which is a fairly accurate representation of how the fairgrounds were laid out. And what's kind of cool about it is the grizzly bear standing on the ledge to the left, looking down upon the exposition ground. Aluminum was a relatively new metal at that time. Anybody that collects Columbian Exposition medals that were held the year before are aware of the dozens, no, over 100, over 150 different aluminum metals that were struck as souvenirs for that exposition. And that theme carried through for the Midwinter, although there are other compositions metals were struck in as well, but there's a lot of aluminum metals. That was just a popular metal in that era. Because prior to that, prior to this electricity, it was very expensive to make aluminum. But with the invention of electricity, we were able to make aluminum much more cost effectively. Next slide. So here's another medal that struck by United States Mint. This is in 1915 Washington, D.C. Sesquicentennial. This was struck in silver and in copper. And it's kind of an unusual metal in that it was silver, but it's kind of an oxidized silver. So the United States Mint did some type of a chemical treatment to these metals after they're struck to give it this subdued, kind of hazy silver look to it. Back in that era from the 40s and 50s, there's a lot of different, I don't know, how do you say it, different experimentation going on with trying to present art collectible metals with different types of finishes. Next. So here's a medal. I mentioned Thomas Elder. Thomas Elder is a very interesting individual. He struck well over 100 medals in his lifetime on lots of different events. And this is one that says, "Thrice defeated, what will the great commoner do now?" And on the reverse is actually a die that's struck with a couple of different obverse dies. And what he's referring to here is William Jennings Bryan. He ran unsuccessfully for the presidency 3 times, 1896, 1900, and in 1908, lost all 3 times, was thrice defeated. And Thomas Elder was not a fan of William Jennings Bryan. And obviously not a lot of other people were as well, because probably many of you are aware of the hundreds of very large satirical medals that were made, most of them cast, you know, basically poking fun at William Jennings Bryan. And there's also about 7 or 8 different silver medals that were struck, also satirical medals of William Jennings Bryan. Those are the medals I collect. I don't collect the cast medals. But there's a book by Swornstein that documents all of the Bryan medals from that era. Next slide, please. So here's just a couple of interesting advertisements for the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition. And I mentioned that I strike medals commemorating different events. I've been doing that for 10 years. And in 2015, on the 100th anniversary of the Panama Pacific International Exposition, I struck a number of medals. And a group of us, I host an event once or twice a year where about 15 or 20 different collectors of so-called dollars, we get together and we have a 4-day educational symposium. Mike Wayner has joined us a number of times. But in 2015, we spent 3 days in San Francisco, 1 day at the in Golden Gate Park where the 1894 Midwinter was held, 1 day in the Marina District where the 1915 PPIE was held, and 1 day on Treasure Island where the 1939 GGIE was held. But that the image to the left there, when we were at the Midwinter in Golden Gate Park at the Dwight Young Museum, they had a T-shirt with that design on it. I remember buying that T-shirt at the Young Museum in 2015. Next slide, please. So here's the exposition grounds, the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition. And next one. Oh no, excuse me, that's the Midwinter. Oh no, wait, what was that? No, that was the PPIE. Never mind, that was the PPIE. Yeah, that's PPIE. And here's the Palace of Fine Arts. Now, maybe some of you are aware, but maybe not all of you, like the 1915 PPIE or the Midwinter, or like the Columbian Exposition, or whatever they may be. They built dozens, sometimes hundreds of buildings that are all of a temporary nature, made out of staff and plaster. But the finest arts, particularly those from overseas, were not allowed to be stored in those temporary structures because the insurance wouldn't cover them unless they're in a permanent structure. So most of the expositions, their art exhibits were normally they'd have 1 or several permanent structures where they would house the most expensive artifacts that were going to be exhibited at the expositions. And such was the case of the Palace of Fine Arts. Next slide, please. This is the official medal for the 1915 PPIE. This is struck by the United States Mint. They had a press there and they struck the bronze varieties and sold them there. They struck the silver and gold plated at the Philadelphia Mint and shipped them there. But what's kind of interesting, at the show that Bill Hyder and I were at last week, one of the individuals, and he may be, I think he's a member of PCNS, Doug, I think Ward is perhaps his last name, Douglas Ward, I'm not sure, but I met him.
Yeah, he's here now.
Okay. Well, anyhow, I think he's the one who discovered there's like a die crack or a gouge in the sail above Arco, the ship Arco there. There's some masts there, and in that area, he discovered a little die gouge. So we started looking at various metals, and we found that die gouge on silver metals, the gold-plated metals, and the bronze metals. So it's going to making us kind of rethink what actually may have happened there. Perhaps those dies got shipped from Philadelphia after the silver metals were struck. Perhaps they actually struck silver metals at the exposition. I don't know. There's a story there that needs to be told that we haven't figured quite out. Haven't really figured it out yet, but we're kind of looking into it. Next slide. Here's the gold-plated variety. And truthfully, probably most of you don't realize this unless you've taken the time to read Bill's and my book, but all the grading firms and Hilber and Kaplan and everybody else said that these metals are struck in silver, brass, and bronze. Well, the silver was correct. They weren't struck in brass or struck in gold-plated. There are no brass varieties known, and they were not struck in bronze either. I found an advertisement that was placed advertising these metals for sale and identified 4 different bronze varieties that the United States Mint was selling: a statuary bronze, antique bronze, oxidized bronze, and another bronze. I can't think of the name of it at the moment. But anyhow, I think sooner or later, the grading firms are going to start recognizing those different varieties and certifying them as such, but they're not quite there yet. Next slide. Oh, here's the advertisement. I believe this advertisement was placed by Fair and Zerby. He had the contract to sell all United States Mint products there, as well as the official metal. United States Mint struck 5 different coins for the PPIE: a $50, a gold $1, a gold $2.50, and 2 gold $50 pieces to round on the octagonal. Those 2 gold coins were actually engraved by Robert Aiken, the same person who engraved the medal, the official medal, which is down below. And to the right is in a large section of that advertisement where they're saying the medal is authorized by Congress, etc. And it says there, bronze, bright, oxidized, antique, and statuary, or gold-plated, each 25 cents, with loop for charms 50 cents, coin silver $1. So I was actually shown that by a coin dealer in the Northwest, and when he showed that to me, a light went on. So I knew there are different varieties of these metals, and I've been accumulating them for many years. So after that, Bill Hyder and I sat down and we went through my collection and sorted them out, and they fell quite comfortably into those 4 different types of categories. Next slide, please. So here's some examples of the 4 metals: bright bronze, antique, oxidized, and statuary. 4 different finishes. Next, please. So I mentioned Bryan, William Jennings Bryan, and I mentioned that there were a number of about 8 or 9 or 10 maybe different metals struck in silver that were satirical of him, and this is one of them. The wagon wheel component is the size of a Morgan dollar, and this metal is making fun. If William Jennings Bryan were to be elected president, this is how large our silver dollars would have to have actually full $1 worth of silver in them. William Jennings Bryan felt that the people were being cheated by using a silver dollar that only had 47 cents worth of silver in it. And this is not something I'm going to get into right now, but it really all ties in with the right to strike the free coinage of silver. Next slide, please. So William Jennings Bryan was a very popular, a great speaker, very popular. He actually controlled the Republican or the Democratic Party for probably 15 years or more. And these are just some of the cartoons that were made at that time, poking fun at him. One of his famous speeches was the Cross of Gold speech. Next slide. So here's a couple of photos of William Jennings Bryan. He's giving his candidate speech in 1908, when the third time they ran unsuccessfully for the presidency. Next slide.
Another Centennial Exposition slide. Lovett Battle series, Battle of Trenton,
Okay.
because what Trenton makes, the world takes.
Indeed.
Okay, here's the facts about it. All the history stuff.
Yeah, you know what I was going to say about the Trenton medal is
Yeah.
the Centennial Exposition. There were 8 medals that were struck by George Hampton Lovett. They all commemorate 8 different battles that George Washington fought in 1776, some of which he won and some of which he lost. But as a collector, when I collected those medals and started researching those particular battles, it makes you realize why you're a collector, because the things you learn about the history of our country,
Oh yeah.
and what people like that went through, is just amazing. And those medals bring back the stories of those events that happened at that time. And it's an amazing, wonderful series to collect.
Yep. Definitely. Okay. Washington crossing the Delaware. Rather well-known portrait.
Yes.
Here's more on the Lovett Battle series. What medal? This is from 1876. Wow, that's great. The silver ones are extremely rare.
Yeah, they're all fairly scarce. The white medal is the most common, and there's probably no more than between 10 and 12 certified of each one of them.
Wow.
So that's pretty darn scarce. But when you consider 8 of them, you probably have about 80 or to 100 medals. So people
Right.
think they're fairly common, but they really aren't.
Wow.
But the silver and the bronze, in most cases, there's 1 or 2, maybe perhaps 3, but most cases just 1 or 2 known of those in silver.
Okay.
But I do have a complete collection of all of them in silver, bronze, and white medal. And also, there's a new discovery that came out a few years ago. NGC contacted me and sent me some images of some copper-plated white metal pieces.
Huh.
And I knew that the bronzes were like 2 different qualities, a high-quality bronze and a low-quality bronze. So I thought they must have had 2 different strikings of the bronzes. But I didn't realize that what they really did back in 1776, they struck the white metal ones, a number of those they bronzed.
Got it.
So once NGC sent me those images and they asked me about it, a light went on and I realized, oh, that's what those are.
That's why.
So, now there's actually 4 different varieties of those that collectors can look for.
Cool. George Lovett. Da-da-da-da. Good information, but we're going to skip ahead. Battles of the Revolution and the Civil War. There's a new, okay. Lewis and Clark Exposition, 1905 in Portland.
Yeah, there's one. The St. Louis was in 1904. The Lewis and Clark was in 1905 on the 100th anniversary of the Corpse of Discovery.
Right.
Lewis and Clark left St. Louis in 1804 and arrived in Portland in 1805. So on the 100th anniversary of those dates, those expositions were held in those corresponding cities.
Right. Okay. World Columbian Exposition, 1893. Ooh, St. Guadens. Bronze.
Yeah, that's actually the obverse was designed or engraved by Augustus St. Guadens, and the reverse was done by Charles Barber.
Ah.
And that's a very popular medal from the Columbian Exposition.
Sure. Sure.
The original St. Gaudens reverse was controversial because of a nude boy on it.
Yes.
So
you're
apparently nude women were okay, but nude boys were not.
Oh, Lord.
I think I'm back.
What's interesting about this medal is one came up recently in a stack sale that had the Pope's name on it in the back.
Whose name?
The Pope.
Oh, well, that would be an award medal. The award medal is much larger, and there was about, I don't know how many thousands that were struck of the larger medals. It took them 2 or 3 years to strike them all up. This is the so-called dollar size. This one is 38 millimeters, and there's only 4 different. You can see the little insert on this one. It says C. Emmerich and Company. There's
Mhm.
only 4 different inserts known for this particular size, so-called dollar Augusta St. Gaudens medal.
Okay, jumping ahead. Washington Valley Forge Centennial.
This is really cool. It's what I call one of the 3 kings. There are 3 silver medals that are 3 of my favorites. This is the Washington medal, and there's also one with Grant on it, HK 12A, and there's also one with Roosevelt on it, HK 308. So those 3 medals in silver, I refer to them as the 3 kings. They're all quite scarce. There's probably no more than, well, the Roosevelt's probably the most common. There's maybe about 2 dozen of those known, but the Washington and the Grant, there's probably maybe around a dozen known of those
Wow.
in
Okay.
silver.
Yeah. Alaska Yukon Exposition Gold.
This is another medal that was engraved by George Morgan. George Morgan engraved an unusually large number of these Exposition medals, not only in the Northwest, but also throughout all the southern states. There are a lot of southern expositions that were held in the few decades prior to this, in the 1880s and 90s. And Morgan engraved quite a few of those. So, and what's also interesting about this is the reverse die I acquired. Well, a friend of mine, a so-called dollar collector friend of mine, acquired that reverse die. And in our latest book, So-Called Dollars from the Pacific Coast Expositions by Bill Hyder and myself, we made a deluxe edition. And in the deluxe edition, we embedded it in the cover of
Yes.
100 of those. The medals struck from this reverse die, and had Daniel Carr make a different die commemorating our book. And we struck those in brass, and the only way you could get the brass medals at that time was by buying the book.
Right.
That was pretty cool. It turned out pretty nice. And those
Yeah.
books, the deluxe editions, are all sold out.
Okay. Wells Fargo Centennial.
Oh, totally awesome medal. Nobody knows who engraved this, which is kind of curious because the engraving is so spectacular. This wasn't just some common engraver, but it's an awesome medal. That's not particularly scarce, but it sells for a lot of money because everybody wants it. So it doesn't make any difference if one comes up in auction every month. They just keep going up and up in value. It's not like the Washington medal we looked at a few minutes ago, where one comes up every few years. You can buy this one in most anytime you want. You just have to pay for it.
Okay. We're almost done. Oregon
This is-
Statehood Centennial.
Yeah, this is one of the few gold medals that are struck in the so-called dollar series. This is Eisenhower Buchanan medal. It's also struck in silver.
Okay.
And go ahead.
Grant
Oh, here's the Grant
Continental.
medal I referred to earlier. This struck in 1869. And it's an awesome medal. Beautiful design.
Yeah.
It's engraved by William Barber. And it's one of my favorites. So I have to show that one. So when I'm doing a slide presentation with Dennis Tucker, I'm just picking out medals I like. And I also try to pick out medals that are somehow mint related, since he is the publisher of the Red Book and they have coins in their book. So I try to pick out, medals struck by the United States Mint that correspond with those coins.
Yes. Okay.
As this medal was struck by the United States Mint and engraved by William Barber, Barber coin.
Yep. Okay. And that was it.
That was it.
And here's how you get in touch with Jeff.
Well, that's actually old contact. My email and phone number are the same. I no longer live in Carson, or no longer live in Northern Nevada. I actually moved back to Northern California about 1.5 years ago.
Awesome.
Yeah. Good to be back.
Okay. So I'm stopping sharing. Anybody have any questions for Jeff? We can now see again. If not, I mean, it was pretty well explained.
Hey, Jeff, did all the pieces that Morgan made, did he put that little M on it?
No, most of them, I would probably say most of them do not have his mark on them. No,
Okay.
Any clue who made the Wells Fargo medals?
no, I have no clue. I do not know. I will say this, and I believe it to be true, as far as the Wells Fargo medal goes, is there's an individual that's a coin dealer that told me he was hired by the Wells Fargo, not Fred Halliburton either, that was hired by the Wells Fargo Mint to inventory their metals collection. And he told me that they have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of original Wells Fargo medals in their original boxes still in their museum in San Francisco.
So along those lines, and Steve will remember the years perhaps, but Bob Chandler had been the vice president for history of Wells Fargo. And he wrote a piece in the old PCNS Quarterly that catalogs the Wells Fargo medals. And some of those weren't released. And my guess is that some of those medals that you just referred to might be those.
Right.
A few
You think it's a different non-release medal, or you think it's the same original?
Oh, there are some non-released medals.
Yeah.
A pair came up on eBay a while back, and I bid pretty aggressively. I got one for $10.
That's aggressive, huh?
And I lost the other one for a couple of hundred.
Okay.
You know, as far as I could tell, they were both from this unreleased series, but whatever it was that, you know, the other guy had the other one.
Well, I do have a Wells Fargo medal. I believe it was issued by Wells Fargo, dated 1952. I'm aware of a few others as well. There's actually a prominent Wells Fargo collector in Southern California, Jim Hunt, and I think he has a number of unusual Wells Fargo
Jim
medals.
has a lot of them. Jim does have
Yeah.
a lot of them. Some of them are really weird shape. One of them's like 9 sides.
Oh yeah.
I'll have to dig them out.
Okay. One last piece of business, unless anybody has another question for Jeff.
Just that I would like, Jeff, what is your new book going to be out? What is it dated through? The medals going through what date?
Well, our new book, we're actually publishing the original book by Hyder and Cap, and we have so many more medals that need to be included and cataloged that we're going to be publishing it in 2 volumes. So we're going to be supplanting the current reference book. Volume 1 is due out. It's imminent, probably in the next few months. And it's about half there's about probably in the current book, there's probably about 800 so-called dollars. About half of them are associated with a fair or an exposition, and the other half with some other national or some other historical event. So volume 1, which is imminent to come out, is going to cover all the so-called dollars from the fairs and expositions. Following that, we'll be coming out with volume 2, which will cover all the other medals like the Erie Canal completion medal in 1826,